Welcome back to Proxammer, everybody. And today we're going to be taking a sort of a general look at how to deal with the new Tyranids. And we're going to be basically assessing whether or not Craftworld Eldar are equipped to actually compete with the new Tyranid book, which, by the way, is probably one of the strongest sets of rules in a while. So I just want to basically just preface this video, though, with a congratulations for the Tyranid Codex. Now, I'm not congratulating GW here, but for all the Tyranid players out there who have suffered edition after edition with, really bad rules, to be honest with you, and really bad matchups across the board, I salute you, honestly. And I'm very happy that you guys got a book that is actually good and that basically includes everything you guys have been asking for years and years, decades. To be honest with you guys, the last time the Tyranids were this good was in 4th edition. And that was a long time ago. And I remember in 4th edition how scared I was of going against Tyranids with my Imperial Guard and Eldar both. And from 5th edition on, Tyranids have really struggled, not only with codex creep, but with just the rules that were around during, especially 5th and 6th edition. I feel like they really got, hurt by the rules that basically were presented in the main rulebook. But now the new Tyranid Codex is out. It's been out for a while, and it is nasty. In fact, it's so nasty that, honestly, it's been winning almost 70% of all the tournaments out there. So it's pretty much as nasty as Harlequins were when the Harlequins first came out with the Craftworld Eldar Codex. And they quickly overran Harlequins as the most competitive army in competitive play. So why is that? Why are Tyranids such a terror? And I really think it comes down to the fact that in ages past, Tyranids had one basic problem. And that was that they didn't necessarily lack any mobility. They didn't necessarily lack, cool special rules or anything. The problem with old Tyranids was that they just didn't do any damage. And they were too easy to kill. So basically they would drop down. They would do really bare minimum damage. And then they would be killed in return very easily. And that is no longer the case. The new Tyranids are not only incredibly tough, but they do insane amounts of damage. And they kept, if not increased, the amount of mobility that, they had before. So they have a lot of strengths now that honestly a lot of books just don't have. And the combination of their strengths work so well together that honestly GW is probably going to be looking at severely nerfing several of their units that have been, to be honest with you, spammed. And we're going to talk about those in this video and how the Craftworld Eldar can even compete with these guys and come out on top. So what we're going to be doing in this video is we're going to be taking a look at the most deadly Tyranid threats, the ones that, basically are considered the strongest units in the Tyranid Codex. We're going to be looking at which units the Craftworld Eldar have to counter and compete without tailoring, though, because obviously, any tailored list is going to be effective against any other list. But we're going to be generally looking at the most popular Eldar units, and how they stack up. And again, these are going to be units that you mostly will probably have in your army anyway. And we'll go into that. And then we're going to look at some general tips and tricks on how to basically stay alive and prevail when going against the new Tyranid menace. So I've played several games against these guys since their new book. Honestly, they're one of the toughest armies that I have to go against now. They're very tough. They're very strong. And honestly, sometimes winning is based on pure luck and good rolls during the first couple turns of the game. But when we take a look at what the new Tyranid Menace has, we're looking at a series of very tough and deadly monsters that are effective at both ranged and in melee. Oftentimes both. One of the best flyers in the game, the Harpy, which is absolutely incredibly OP, and they're probably going to nerf it soon, to be honest with you. But as of now, a lot of players are running 2 of them, and we'll go into what they have in just a second. The Synaptic Imperatives ability is absolutely disgusting, especially when you consider that you can get a 4+ invulnerable save on all your monsters, and on infantry you can get a 5+ invulnerable save. And this comes with the Zoanthrope, and I'll explain what and how Synaptic Imperatives works in just a second. Not only that, but they're really fast. A lot of their models have, speed 7, 8, or 9, or even higher. And when Synapse creatures are within 18 inches of your Farseers and Warlocks, you're getting -1 to your Psyche tests. Warriors are very strong now, and they can devastate multiple units a turn as a mixed combat unit, mixed role unit. Kind of like Shining Spears, they have really heavy weapons at range, and they're really powerful in melee as well, and they're cheap. They're only 25 points a model, so I also hear they're probably going to get increased in points. But as of now, 25 points a model is very cost effective. And as a whole, the whole army has several units that can pump out an extreme amount of mortal wounds. They get around invul saves and heavy armor and things like that. Oftentimes in addition to regular damage, which we'll go ahead and go into as well. So real quick, I want to explain what Synaptic Imperatives is and does. Basically what it is depending on what units your opponent has in his army, each Synapse creature unit has a special ability called the Synaptic Imperative. And basically, once per game, he can activate that ability, and all your Synapse creatures and all units within 6 of those Synapse creatures get the bonus. And depending on what the unit is, the bonus will be different. For example, Zoanthropes are the ones that give the army-wide, basically, as long as you're in Synapse range, you give an army-wide 4+ invulnerable save to monsters, and they also give a 5+ invulnerable save to infantry that are within Synapse range. Now, this includes the Synapse creatures themselves, because they are counted as being within their own range. So, warriors with a 5+ invul save, Carnifexes, if they're in range, they get a 4+ invul save, etc. So it's very powerful. Now, it can only be used once a battle. That's the saving grace here, is that once it's used, it can't be used again. But every turn, your opponent can use a different Synaptic Imperatives ability. So, it really is very adaptable. If your opponent thinks you're going to do a lot of damage to him, he can pop it. The 4+ invul save Synaptic Imperatives, and that's the Zoanthropes that give that. And trust me, every Tyranid list is going to have at least one unit of Zoanthropes just for that ability. If he's going to do a lot of damage to you, he might pop the Tyranid Warrior ability, which does more damage, basically, for your entire army. So basically, it's very adaptable. There's a lot of other ones too. I can't remember them all off the top of my head, but basically it allows your opponent to adapt to whatever situation he needs in the game. And also that includes being better at denying the witch, which I believe is the either the Neuranthrope or the Maliceptor Synaptic Imperative. Now, moving on to Warriors. Now, Warriors are one of the units that, honestly, Eldar kind of struggle against. And the reason being is because they're so cost-effective and they're so hard and awkward to kill. A lot of our units are either honestly designed to kill light infantry or heavy infantry. And the problem with Warriors is they're kind of somewhere in the middle of that. They have strength and toughness 5, which makes them an awkward target against things like shirking weapons. Basically, we have to wound on 5s now. They have a vast array of deadly anti-infantry ranged weapons in retaliation, which can just shred our infantry. Space Marines don't really care too much about a lot of this stuff at range the warriors can do, but armies like Eldar and, honestly, even Dark Eldar as well, are going to be taking a lot of damage from these guys. I actually kind of feel more sorry for Dark Eldar in this matchup, to be honest. Even though they have poison weapons, the return fire is very deadly. Now, the other thing is, these guys have 3 wounds apiece. So this puts them at a kind of an awkward damage level to kill, which basically means that a lot of our damage 2 weapons are going to be more inefficient against units like warriors, essentially. Now, in my games, I've actually found that one of the biggest counters to warriors, believe it or not, is that there's 2 units that I've found effective. One is warlocks with singing spears. So I ran this unit, kind of because I had the idea that singing spears might not actually be that bad. And singing spears actually worked very well. I was able to, with about 125 points worth of warlocks, I was able to kill a whole unit of warriors. So essentially what I did was, they popped out of the Wave Serpent. They used their psychic powers. I actually chose to, honestly use Smite because I knew the math wasn't really in my favor if I charged in. So they used Smite, got a couple wounds with that. The Warlocks used Singing Spears that they threw. They killed a warrior with that, and then they charged in and killed the rest. Now, the cool thing about Singing Spears is that they actually have damage 3. So that means that every wound that goes through against a Tyranid warrior is going to be a kill. So these guys were really efficient, and they took out more than their points worth of warriors. It was a unit of 5. And then they died, essentially, to basically another unit of warriors who charged them in return. But that's okay. Honestly, they made up more than their points worth, and they caused the enemy a lot of distraction. But these guys are a really cost-effective unit to trade with enemy units. They're also not bad against Tyranid monstrous creatures because even though most Tyranid monstrous creatures are very tough, Witchblades always wound on a 2+. Now, the other unit that's not bad against Tyranid warriors is Wraithblades, and I'm talking the Ghost Axe and Force Shield variant. Now, the reason why is because they have a really strong invulnerable save, and they reduce the damage dealt by 1. So those dual bone swords that warriors like taking are not going to be doing nearly as much damage to Wraithguard with Force Shields and Ghost Axes, especially since they reduce damage by 1, right? So basically, you're not going to be losing much. I think on average, you may lose 1 Wraithguard and maybe a little bit of another Wraithguard. And in return, the Wraithblades can really do a number on Tyranid warriors because they don't really have much armor, and these guys wound them on 3s. And lastly, honestly, anything with cost-effective volume of fire is going to be effective against warriors, even if you have to wound on 5s. Reason being is because with the right buffs, a unit of warriors really only has a 4+ save at the end of the day. Now, it could be in terrain, granted, but usually warriors have a very short range and they try to close with you. So unless they're in light cover, they're not really going to get the benefit of much terrain. So either Shuriken Fire, Last Blaster Fire, Shuriken Cannons, anything like that can be very effective at taking down warriors. Now, I will say that could change depending on what hive fleet they choose. There's a lot of hive fleets that give some additional survivability. Watch out for that. You may need to adjust accordingly if you're going against a more survivable hive fleet. Now, the next one is obviously the one that everyone talks about being OP, right? That is the Harpy. Now, the Harpy is a big issue, and the reason why is because the Harpy is incredibly fast. It moves 40 inches a turn. It can hit you turn 1, even if you're behind a ruin or hiding. It can get a good angle on you and hit you with twin heavy venom cannons to rip apart your tanks or monsters, or twin heavy Stranglethorn cannons to mangle infantry. Now, in my experience, I've only seen these guys taken with the heavy venom cannons. I think that's probably what the meta is to take them to basically rip apart tanks turn 1. And they're very effective at doing that. they can rip apart a fire prism on average rolls, no problem. And the sad thing is that most of the time we rely on hiding our fire prisms behind ruins and obscuring terrain to survive turn 1 against a lot of shooting. But these guys have such speed that they can easily get angles on you that you wouldn't think. I lost a couple fire prisms in my first game against these guys because I didn't realize that the Harpy was that fast. And I didn't think he could get it. My mistake. My huge mistake, because it basically cost me 2 fire prisms. So you got to be careful about that. They can reach you turn 1. Now, the good thing about this is that they are considered aircraft. So if you get the first turn on them, it's very hard for them to hide. Because I believe, if I'm not mistaken, aircraft cannot hide behind obscuring terrain. So usually these guys are a first turn wonder. If they don't get first turn though, usually I've seen my opponents put them in reserve because they'll just die in retaliation. Now, the thing about the Harpy is not only does it have incredible shooting, but it actually deals mortal wound damage to units it moves over as well. So technically this thing can move over something, deal mortal wounds to it, and then blast it with heavy venom cannons as well. So even your toughest units could be in danger of being killed. Now, it is also pretty durable for a flyer. It is toughness 7. Most flyers are toughness 6. And it can become a synapse creature with the correct upgrades. Okay, the reason why this is important is because usually first turn, this guy would just fly over and he would fly way past anything that's a synapse creature, and he would not be able to benefit from something like synaptic imperatives, giving a 4+ invul save. So he'd be very vulnerable, and then yeah, he'd kill some stuff, but then he'd just get ripped apart by everything in your army. It would isolate itself and be destroyed. And honestly, yeah, it might be an even trade, but then again, it might not, and he might just die, right? But with the correct upgrades, it actually becomes a synapse creature, and things like, 4+ invul save can really save this guy from a lot of your firepower and make this guy extremely hard to kill even when he's right in front of your army. And that makes the Harpy extremely competitive, annoying, and dangerous. Now, I think obviously, this has been talked about in the Eldar community before, but the biggest counter to the Harpy, in my opinion, in my experience, is fire prisms. However, you have to use these guys right. If your opponent gets first turn, you need to keep these guys in reserve. There's just no other way about it. He will kill them. Any experienced opponent will look at these guys and say, oh, linked fire, need to kill these things. And then your fire prisms are dead, right? So you want to put them in reserve. If you have to put them in strategic reserve, that's not a big deal. A few extra command points isn't going to hurt them. Now, the reason why fire prisms are good against Harpies is because not only do they ignore invul saves with the linked fire, but the other cool thing about them is they can take crystal targeting matrix. So if you take one of these with a crystal targeting matrix and you use linked fire, all of those shots that are going towards that Harpy are going to ignore the negative modifiers to hit. So you're hitting on full ballistic skill. And the Harpy's tough, but it's not that tough. You're wounding on 2+ with this thing. So you're hitting on 3+, wounding on 2+, ignoring invul saves, and doing essentially, on average, 6 damage worth of damage for each shot that goes through. So even if you have 2 of these things, on average, that's going to be around 12 wounds. So that's already almost a dead Harpy. That last wound can be taken out by, to be honest with you, even the shuriken catapults on the fire prism can take out that last wound. So fire prisms are extremely effective at dealing with Harpies. And yes, it is going to take 2 fire prisms to kill 1 Harpy. I know that. But the cool thing about this is that's about average. That's what you should be doing. 2 fire prisms should be taking out something like a Harpy in 1 turn. It does cost a little bit of command points as well, but trust me, it's worth it because Harpies will just kill you all day long over and over and over again. So you really need to be able to take those out as soon as possible. Now, some of you might be saying, well, oh my God, I don't have fire prisms. What am I going to do? What am I going to do against a Harpy? There are tons of other things that are effective at dealing with Harpies, just not as effective. So, for example, support weapons are decent. D-cannons can really put a lot of wounds on Harpies. They deal mortal wounds, so a lot of those invul saves will be ignored. Now, they aren't as effective, but under the right circumstances, support weapons can actually be very good when coupled with Rangers with the Resonator Shard. This will give them rerolls to hit. So you can actually get quite a few decent, kills with a unit of D-cannons if your opponent is not careful with his unit. So again, he can fly over turn 1, but if he is unable to kill what he wants to kill, or even if he does, he's going to be facing down some D-cannons. And there's also nothing preventing you from putting the unit of D-cannons in strategic reserve and just coming off, the board edge and just doing it like that. Now, I believe the cool thing about D-cannons is they're a vehicle. So I think they're classified as vehicle support weapons. So basically what that means is that you can move on the board and then shoot with no real modifier to your ballista skill except for the Harpy's natural -1 to hit. So the next model is the Hive Tyrant. Now, the Hive Tyrant's a pretty scary model. Now, luckily, you probably won't have to deal with more than one of these unless your opponent is using multiple detachments, because Hive Tyrants are limited to one model per detachment, just like the Autarch is for us. So the Hive Tyrant, though, is extremely deadly. It has two variants, a flying and a ground variant, and both can kill pretty much anything with relative ease. So the winged variant, I think, is probably the more competitive pick because it can come in as reinforcements, has a reliable charge right out of reinforcements, but the foot variant is also very strong because it has increased toughness and increased armor save. So it's a little bit more survivable, and the cool thing about the foot tyrant, for Tyranids, not for us, is that it can take Hive Guard, or Tyrant Guard, which can give it Lookout Sir. So you kind of have to kill them before you can actually hurt the Tyrant. And both Tyrant variants have a 4+ invul save, and honestly are pretty strong, pretty durable. Have a good amount of wounds, a decent toughness. Even the flying version has a toughness 7, so not bad, with a decent armor save and invul save. So these guys are very hard to kill, and they do a lot of damage to our forces. Now, Hive Tyrants are probably one of the more hard units to deal with just because of the fact that you have to get through the obscuring terrain in the first couple turns. Then when it comes out, you have to deal with basically the Tyrant Guard, right? Before you can shoot it. So Hive Tyrants are tough to deal with. But when it does reveal itself and you can actually shoot it, it's eligible to shoot at, Fire Prisms are still the most effective unit we have against these guys for the same reasons as the Harpy. Reason being, they ignore invul saves, they do a lot of damage, they basically ignore all armor, and essentially, they can really wound these guys pretty easily. So, the Wind Riders, on the other hand, I put down as a possible counter, and the reason why, mostly, is because these are a pretty good target for a forewarned kind of shooting phase. So the Flying Hive Tyrant likes to come down and just jump right into combat and mess things up really quickly in the first couple of turns. Now, obviously, if it's not supported right, it's still going to die, but not before it can take out a significant amount of your army and pin you in place. However, if you have a unit of jet bikes waiting in a safe place around your forces, this can deter the Hive Tyrant from coming in because of forewarned. So if you have shuriken cannons on this thing, or honestly even scatter lasers, that many shots going at that Hive Tyrant is going to do some serious damage. And it may, in fact, deter the player from coming in close within 12 inches. So the Wind Riders are also a very good choice as far as a possible counter to at least the winged variant. And at range, Wind Riders of both variants, Shuriken Cannons and Scatter Lasers, are actually pretty good at taking out Tyrant Guard from what I've found out. Yes, Tyrant Guard have an incredible armor save. They have high toughness at toughness 6. But the thing about them is that you're still wounding on 4s, and most of the time, you'll be able to easily just force so many wounds down their throat that they won't be able to save them all. At least with a large unit of these guys. So Wind Riders are a unit that a lot of players already have, and if positioned correctly, they can not only deter a deep striking flying Hive Tyrant, but can also whittle down Tyrant Guard if that Hive Tyrant is on foot. So that your other weapons, like Fire Prisms, your Bright Lances, or whatever, can then target the Hive Tyrant and not have to worry about Lookout Sir or anything like that that could possibly get in the way of you drawing a bead to the Tyrant. And then next up is a unit that, again, is probably going to be the target of nerfs and has been the target of nerfs, the Maleceptor. So the Maleceptor is a very tough monster with toughness 8, 15 wounds, and a 4+ invul base. Doesn't need the Synaptic Imperatives rule to get that 4+ invul save. Now, the crazy thing about this guy is it can cast 2 psychic powers and it does mortal wounds to the closest enemy unit when casting on a 7+. Basically meaning average casts, he's going to be doing mortal wound damage to enemy units. This makes it an insane mortal wound engine. Even after the nerf, this guy can pump out some serious mortal wounds on your units, and honestly can do enough damage sometimes to kill a Wave Serpent if they roll well. So you have to be aware of this guy. Very strong unit and very able to deal with a lot of invul saves and things like that. So, what is the biggest counter to Maleceptors? You guessed it. Again, Fire Prisms. The reason why Fire Prisms are so good, and honestly, I wish I could tell you that it was something different, but Fire Prisms just are a very good counter to a lot of the monstrous creatures in the Tyranid army because they have insane damage, they can ignore invul saves with linked fire, and they just honestly have the ability to be mobile and stay on top of targets like Maleceptors who may try to hide in the early turns of the game. So, really good models for dealing with Tyranid monstrous creatures. Now, again though, D-Cannons aren't bad either. D-Cannons can deal with a lot of the monsters in the Tyranid force pretty effectively as well. Now, something I didn't mention, Maleceptors are very dangerous for a number of reasons against Eldar. Mortal wounds, as well as the ability to kind of negate some of our psychic superiority. But if these guys take the Psychic Scream ability and you have a unit of Warlocks or a Farseer nearby, the Psychic Scream ability can actually make one of our units forget a psychic power. That's right, forget a psychic power. This is in addition to dealing mortal wound damage to everything around it. So, honestly, really hard target to deal with up close, especially for Psychers. So, in my experience, this is another model that's best dealt with at range, because once it gets close, it starts doing those mortal wounds. It's very tough to deal with, and honestly, a lot of our Psychers are going to have to like run away when this thing comes close, right? So, now, I didn't mention this here, but another possible unit that could be good against this thing, if it survives, is a Wraith Lord. Now, the reason why I say that is because the Maleceptor, compared to the other Tyranid creatures, is not that great in combat. It's not combat-oriented, right? It's mostly a close-range Psyker unit that's very tough. So, to be honest with you, if you can get a charge off on a Wraith Lord with Piercing Strikes, you could very easily do some serious damage to it. And again, the Wraith Lord has to survive, but it is a way to deal some serious damage without having to kill it at range. So, again, Wraith Lord, if it survives, can do some serious damage as well. Wraith Guard can also do some serious damage with it with the Wraith Cannons, because Wraith Cannons, again, do mortal wounds, but more importantly, do a lot of just base damage, so they can also be very effective as well. Not as effective as Fire Prisms, but they can still put some serious damage on this thing when they draw a bead to it. So here are just a couple of honorable mentions that are also good against Tyranids as far as units go. So Farseers and Warlocks are good because they can deny the Witch, and they do mortal wounds themselves, which can get past a lot of the invul saves the Tyranids have. Yes, deny the Witch is going to be very important against Tyranids. I can't tell you the amount of times that actually the Tyranid player that I typically go against, I said earlier in the video that I don't like facing him, but he actually doesn't like playing my Eldar either. He thinks it's probably one of the toughest matchups he has. So it's kind of funny because, here I am complaining about Tyranids, how powerful they are against Eldar, and he thinks the same thing on the opposite. He's like, well, shoot, I mean, Eldar are really powerful against me. I'd much rather go against, anything else but Craftworld Eldar. You just have so many deny the Witch, right? So we do have a lot of deny the Witch. Farseers, Warlocks all have it, and this can put a serious dent in our opponent's plans if we manage to roll higher than them on psyche tests, which is not too hard as Eldar in general. So we also have support weapons with D-cannons. I mentioned these a few times, but they have high strength, AP, and damage with indirect fire, and can do mortal wounds. So very good against Tyranid monsters, and honestly, Tyranid warriors as well. Swooping Hawks have the ability to deal auto wounds, and they have really high maneuverability, so they can hit something, do a lot of wounds to it, and they will get their armor save, but if you force enough wounds, you can finish a lot of things off, and then they can jump back to safety. They have high maneuverability and can often stay outside of range of heavy Tyranid threats, and a lot of Tyranid weapons aren't the highest range anyway, except if you're, talking about heavy venom cannons and things like that. Those probably won't be shooting Swooping Hawks. I've also found Vipers to be fairly effective. Now, the thing about the Viper, of course, is that it doesn't do much damage, but actually a subscriber kind of got me thinking more about them, not as a harassment tool, but as a roadblock. And actually, they're very good at it, especially against armies like Tyranids who really have a lot of mobility. Anything to slow them down for a couple turns, especially for so cheap, is very effective. Rangers are also very effective because they can screen out your units from deep strikers and things like that. And they're also good at dealing mortal wounds to their monsters. And what I've found actually is Rangers kind of sometimes go unnoticed by the enemy. Especially in the first couple of turns of the game. Harpies typically aren't going to be shooting at Rangers and things like that. So your Rangers kind of have a few turns to, actually shoot and score some points for you at the same time. And Wind Riders are also very effective, not only because they have a good range, but they can stay out of range of enemy units. Typically, they can stay out of range of assault, being outside 24 inches, especially with battle focus. Now, I'm not so much of a fan of the twin shuriken catapults against Tyranids, especially the kind of Tyranids that are effective in this current state, because they just don't have a lot of light infantry in their armies typically, except for maybe one unit of gargoyles or things like that, but typically those aren't really a big deal. Those usually just die in my experience. So Wind Riders are good at basically staying out of threat range of those big threats while doing significant damage on their own at long range. And lastly, I put Dire Avengers in here because Dire Avengers, when used in good enough numbers, can do significant amounts of damage with the right buffs, especially against things like warriors, and honestly can contribute to killing monsters as well. So just a few general tips and tricks that you can use when facing Tyranids to make your day a little bit easier. The one thing that I have found with Tyranid players is usually they hide their zone thropes very well. But if you do see their zone thropes, if possible, take them out. Because without their zone thropes, they can't use that synaptic comparatives ability that gives their whole army an invul save, basically. And usually Tyranid armies that are built for, ultimate competitiveness or that are built to be very strong are going to have tons of synapse creatures. And usually they're not going to have a problem with any synapse ranges and stuff like that. So target the zone thropes if possible. It might be a little hard to do this against a more experienced player that can hide the zone thrope very easily. But if the opportunity does present itself, do take them out. They're not very hard to take out. They have 4 wounds apiece. They're toughness 5. They do not have the 2+ dread invul save anymore. They only have a 4+ invul save now. So they're not too hard to take out with conventional weapons. Now, the next thing is also be aware of what your opponent has coming in reserve and plan accordingly. There's a bunch of stuff that Tyranids have now that can come from reserve and are absolutely nasty. Way nastier than a lot of other armies can bring stuff from reserves. Think nastier than your models that you can bring from reserve. Nastier than Shining Spears, right? Nastier than Wraith Blades. Be aware of what they have in reserve and plan accordingly. And also don't bunch up too much, because if they have something like a Maliceptor in reserve or something like that, they have a lot of abilities and psychic powers that can target multiple things at once within range. So be very careful. And also, by the way, this includes your Psychers. Psychic Scream is no joke, and Psychic Scream will take out Guide, will take out Doom, it'll take out your favorite psychic powers that your Farseer has. Trust me, you don't want to do this. Now, I know Farseers have Leadership 9, but I've seen it happen. I've seen, opponents roll a 10 on their psychic tests and take away your psychic power. So be very careful about that when you're worrying about his reserves. Make sure that your Farseers and stuff are properly screened so that that doesn't happen. Now, Harpies, they will kill something fragile turn 1. So if you are worried about them getting the first turn, if they get the first turn, keep your softer units in reserve. Trust me, Harpies can reach you turn 1, all right? Even if you're behind obscuring terrain or whatever it is, Harpies do not care. They can reach you. 40 inches, especially if your opponent gets first turn, he knows, usually he's going to know what angles he needs to put his guys in to be able to reach you turn 1. He's going to be wanting to take out your softer units. That means your Fire Prisms, your Wind Riders, he's going to want to take those out right away. So, keep your softer units in reserve. Typically, if you have Wraith Lords or Wave Serpents, on average, they're going to survive a salvo from a Harpy. Just because Wave Serpents have an invul save that's fairly decent, and they have an extra wound as well as the Serpent Shield. So, it's a little hard for Harpies to kill a Wave Serpent in one turn, at least one-on-one. 2 Harpies can definitely kill one. And Wraith Lords as well, just because they have the Wraithbone form, they're a little bit harder to kill for Harpies also. And also, be aware of the Shadows of the Warp range from their Synapse creatures, because as long as you're within 18 inches of a Synapse creature, your Farseers and Warlocks are at -1 on their Psychic tests. So you do have to be careful. However, sometimes this is impossible to get around because a lot of our psychic powers have 18 range, especially the Runes of Battle. So you're going to have to, sometimes have to deal with it, but you don't always have to on certain units. So be aware of Synapse range, be aware of the Shadows in the Warp. It's 18 inches. As long as you're within it, you're at -1 to your psychic tests. So be careful about that and plan accordingly. And honestly, moving a psychic test from a 7+ to an 8+ is a big deal. 8s are very hard to get. 7s are not so difficult. So, you just want to be cognizant of that so that you're not making it harder on yourself throughout the game. Now, again, like I said, though, there are some powers that are just going to have to be, on 8s. However, there are ways Eldar can kind of mitigate that. We have Strands of Fate. We have the Seer Council stratagem and things like that. So there are some things we can do to mitigate it. If you're playing Uthway also, you would automatically mitigate it because you get +1 yourself. But still, it's good to stay out of range if you can. So in conclusion, although Tyranids are by and far the most dominating force in tournaments due to their not only their adaptability with their synaptic imperatives, but their just strength, firepower, and close combat ability as well, and their mobility. Actually, Craftworld Eldar have a lot of tools at their disposal to deal with them, believe it or not. And we're not like a lot of other armies against Tyranids now, which just kind of fold because they can't survive and they can't adapt. So Space Marine factions, in my opinion, have more trouble against Tyranid because not only can they just not really stop their damage and mobility, but they really have no good way of stopping the insane number of psychic powers and mortal wounds that the Tyranid army can throw out. On the other hand, as Eldar, a lot of Tyranid psychic powers are really short-ranged, and guess what? A lot of them are offensive or debuffs. So what that means is they have to get really close to you, and honestly, most of the time, you're going to have Farseers and Warlocks in range to deny. Especially if you're running something like a 3 Farseer list, or you're running a list with multiple Skyrunner Warlocks, he's going to have a really hard time getting psychic powers off most of the game. And that means his deadliest units, his Hive Tyrant, his Maleceptors, his Zoanthropes are going to have more trouble than it's worth usually casting psychic powers. So, the other thing is we have plenty of other options too. Fire Prisms can ignore invul saves. Warlocks are very good at dealing with things like Warriors as well as denying the Witch. And Wind Riders also stand out to me as being able to do a lot of damage at range while staying safe themselves. And these units stand out to me, obviously, as being some of the best units in dealing with the top Tyranid threats. Now, there are tons of other units that can deal with these guys, as I've mentioned in the honorable mention section of this video for units that are good at dealing with Tyranids. But these are just the top counters. Now, these 3 units are in a lot of Eldar armies. This isn't really a tailoring job. You know, I'm not going out there and saying, oh, take this, this, and this, so that you can perfectly tailor against everything your opponent has. That's not what this is. Now, if your list doesn't run Fire Prisms, there are some honorable mentions that can easily replace it. Support weapons, for example, can easily replace it. Honestly, Warwalkers with the right setup can do decent damage as well if you run Warwalkers in your list. It just really depends on what you think is effective against certain targets. So, for example, Bright Lances are very effective against monsters. If your list has Bright Lance, a lot of good, Bright Lances in it, whether it's Wraith Lords or Warwalkers, that can also be effective. I didn't mention this too much, but if you have Wraith Lords are a great deterrent, especially if they're behind line of sight. Wraith Lords can do significant damage with Piercing Strike against a lot of their monsters. Especially Warriors, I feel, especially when they can sweep and things like that. Wraith Lords are very good. The problem with Wraith Lords, however, is that they tend to die to things like, honestly, to things like Harpies. But again, if the Harpies are not an issue, Wraith Lords can do very well. And the Wraith Seer is also very good, just like Wraith Lords are. Probably better in this matchup because they can also deny the Witch and things like that. Wraith Seers are very effective as well. So it really just depends what you want to run. There's a bunch of different options. It's just the main things you have to worry about is you have to ask yourself this question when you look at your list. How am I going to deal with Tyranid monsters creatures? How am I going to deal with toughness 7, toughness 8 creatures with 13 plus wounds that also have an invulnerable save? So that just means you have to have enough firepower to be able to at least kill one creature, or 1 to 2 creatures a turn with your anti-tank weapons. Now, that can be kind of hard to do with Bright Lances, but it is possible. Honestly, Warwalkers are pretty cost effective with Bright Lances. That might be able to do the job. 6 Bright Lances is no joke. And with decent rolling, they can definitely do some heavy damage and heavy lifting for you. And with the Fire and Fade stratagem, you can fade them back behind cover and not have to worry about a lot of their firepower. Again, though, I have to say this, Harpies. Harpies don't care about your line of sight. They have extreme movement, and they're very maneuverable. They're not like normal flyers that can just pivot once. They can pivot twice anytime during their movement. So that means that they're always going to be able to basically be in a position where they can shoot you. Those probably honestly need to be the first target. Now, the Harpies are an easy target because they can basically always be seen themselves. So even though they're very heavy damage, honestly, they do very heavy damage, they're also very easy to see themselves. They're pretty durable for flyers, but they're not that durable. So I think you can get away with shooting things like bright lenses at them and stuff like that and not have to worry too much. Now, the invul save can be an issue, but again, if you don't have fire prisms, you're going to have to rely on just force of numbers, force of anti-tank weapons to deal with them. And honestly, it shouldn't be too bad. I mean, you can afford 2 war walkers for every fire prism, essentially. So, if you have a list that would normally maybe have, 6 fire prisms or 3 fire prisms in it, maybe instead you have 6 war walkers, right? And that can deal some very significant damage as well to Tyranids. And honestly, it wouldn't be bad against other armies too. It just depends what you have in your list. And honestly, I have to say, with all due respect, the nerfs are coming out soon to Tyranids. I think the nerfs are warranted, a lot of them that I've heard about. I don't know exactly what they're going to nerf, but I have a feeling they're going to target Tyranid warriors, the Harpy, the Maleceptor, and the Winged Hive Tyrant. That's what I've heard. Now, and I think Pyrovores, if I'm not mistaken, but honestly, I haven't had much trouble with them. But if anyone has some experience going against Pyrovores, I hear they can be very nasty. It's just the particular opponent that I usually play against Nids doesn't have them and doesn't like them. So I've never gotten the experience of them. But let me know what you think. And in general, if you guys have any tips on facing Tyranids yourselves that you want to add in the comments, please feel free to. I'm by no means the ultimate authority on facing Nids. I've played them throughout the years in so many editions, but you guys may have some insights into facing them that I don't. And to be honest with you guys, in full disclosure, again, Nids are honestly one of the hardest armies that I have, fought this edition. They're very tough. In fact, honestly, this isn't meant to anything negative, but I've lost many games against Tyranids. It's not because they're super OP or anything like that, in my opinion. I mean, I think they're very strong, and I think the problem with Nids right now is that they're very well costed for what they do. So Harpies, Hive Tyrants, things like that, they're just too good for their points. I wouldn't say they're completely overpowered, though. I mean, there's ways to deal with them as Craftworld Eldar. It's just that in the wider meta against other armies, they tend to just overrun them very quickly and outcompete them for points. So, again, I think the point changes will bring them back into line. I don't think any of the rules necessarily are too OP. But, it's just like the Harlequin problem, right? Sorry. I've had a kind of a sore throat the past few days, but it's kind of like the Harlequins. They were considered one of the most OP factions at the time, and the reason why is because, and I have a video on this, but the reason why is because they were just undercosted for what they could do. A lot of their units were just, they had too many, kind of special rules and too much, kind of ability to negate enemy damage for their points cost. And I think that's exactly what the Tyranids are right now. So just like the Void Reaver, kind of thing where they bumped it from 90 points to 130 points. I think they're going to basically do the same thing to the Harpy, and the other models are going to bump them up by a significant amount of points to balance it out a little bit. So that's probably coming soon. So I think Tyranids are going to be a little less oppressive in tournaments. However, I have to say, this is my prediction, all right? I believe that the Tyranids are still going to be one of the top factions in tournaments even after the nerfs. I just don't think a couple of points changes are going to change the army at its core, which is very fast, does a lot of damage, has a lot of psychic potential as far as their powers and stuff like that. And honestly, at the end of the day, is very hard to kill. All right, everybody, that's it for today's video. Again, if you have any tips and tricks on how to fight Tyranids, leave them in the comments. Experiences that you've had with the enemy menace, the Tyranid menace, who have, you know, devoured many Craftworlds, who have killed many Eldar in the fluff and stuff. Let us know in the comments what you guys think about how to deal with them. All right, everybody, peace out. See you guys in the next video. Have a good one. Oh, and if you haven't checked it out yet, check out my video on a bad list contest. And if you have a bad list, go ahead and submit one. We need more submissions.